is also the fact that it requires substantial financial resources. And substantial financial resources, one is the contribution from our side towards that resources, the other one is to tap into those resources which are available globally. I think we are lagging behind in both those aspects. Areas which are affordable. It's really a comparison between impact and the cost. Which are the larger impact areas that we need to tackle, and what are the cost-effective areas where the regulation could come handy. And the classic example and the classic way to approach this is by introducing the concept of taxonomy, whereby you put in all the projects in one place and then develop them into a bankable proposition, so that you can tap into the international funding which is available out there to address this issue. And climate doesn't differentiate between boundaries. So therefore, one needs to understand that it's a collective effort. We need to take it in a collective way, address it in a collective fashion as well. And for a country like Pakistan, which seriously lack resources, they need that resource support too.
Hello everyone. Welcome to another special podcast of All Things Money. Today we have a very special guest, Mr. Zafar Masud, who is the president of Bank of Punjab and also the chairman of the board of directors of OGDC. How are you, Zafar Saab?
Very well, thank you very much, Ammar.
That's amazing. So Zafar Saab, we are specifically focusing on climate change and what we can do to essentially avoid whatever the negative inferences of that are. So one question that I want to ask you is, Pakistan has always been one of the lowest emission per capita countries in the world. If you look at it, Pakistan essentially is one of the lowest, in the lowest quintile of emissions per capita, largely due to lower coal usage. So what should Pakistan really do? Is it an emissions problem or is it more of an efficiency problem?
Yeah, it's actually a very good question. So emission per se, while it's under control, we talk about what, 0.84% per metric ton per capita CO2, but the situation and equation is changing because the contribution of coal is increasing as a fuel, largely and obviously for obvious reasons. There are economics that are driving it. But also there are other factors. The other factors including the population growth, for example. On the population side, we are one of the worst in the world. It's 2.55%, and that by the very default, this aspect, our demand for transportation is increasing, and transportation is the major factor, not necessarily towards emission per se, but surely towards the pollution and making the situation and equation more complex. So while we are perhaps one of the lowest in the world, the world average is around 4.6%. US is as bad as 15 metric ton. China is 7. India is 1.8. But I guess it's the transportation piece which makes the things more complicated. And when you look at AQI in the urban areas, we are one of the worst in the world. Keeping that aspect in view, I am not very hopeful that this situation will continue as is. I think if we don't address these issues now, they will come back and hound us at some point in time. Merely 25% of our urban transportation is public transport. The rest of the commute is actually a contributor towards the pollution, and that needs to be looked at. So one, you have this, the other one. The third one is obviously, as you talked about, the infrastructure piece per itself. The fitness of the cars to begin with. The fitness of the cars, are 70 to 80% of the pollution coming from the transport sector is because of the engine efficiency. 40% of our cars are below the age of, are beyond the age of 10 years. All those things are culminating and contributing towards the situation towards pollution. And same goes for the wastage. The waste recycling is not taking place. Agriculture sector, when you talk about, it's a major contributor towards pollution because the wastage is missing. Oil and gas sector is 14%, which also has a major contribution to the methane. And methane, by the way, is 25 times more contributor towards the the pollution index than CO2. So we need to be mindful of the fact that where are the culprits and how to address them, and what are the ways of addressing them.
So essentially, this is more of an efficiency problem where we know what exactly needs to be done. And let's say if the car engines are not efficient, they need to be made more efficient. If the quality of fuel is low, that needs to be increased. And let's say if there is like transmission and distribution losses in gas transportation, methane, which is as you said earlier, is much more dangerous than typical carbon. So we need to work on that. How do we do that? What do you think needs to be done to really fix this?
Okay, so Ammar, so there are 2 or 3 pieces which are very important. One is the regulatory piece. So the regulation per se and its implementation. So I happened to be in China last month, and the education that I picked up from there was basically it's the education, it's the regulation, it's its strictest possible implementation that does the trick. And to my mind, that's the starting point. The second piece is obviously the collaboration amongst the various stakeholders, starting from the government to the private sector to the individuals as a society. It should be collective effort. It is such a gigantic and enormous agenda to fulfill that not one party can do it. It has to be a collective effort. And the last but not the least is also the fact that it requires substantial financial resources. And substantial financial resources, so one is the contribution from our side towards that resources, the other one is to tap into those resources which are available globally. I think we are lagging behind in both those aspects. In fact, all the 3 constituencies that I talked about. So to me, the easiest and the most important one is to get the regulation in place and then start implementing it. Just to warn you here, Ammar, that when we talk about regulations, laws per se, we need to be mindful of the fact that we need to keep the affordability of our people in mind. Our affordability of our people is seriously compromised. So we need to prioritize and see what are those areas which are affordable. It's really a comparison between impact and the cost. Which are the larger impact areas that we need to tackle, and what are the cost effective areas where the regulation could come handy. So you allocate the resources to those areas where the impact is higher, but the cost is not affordable. And I can quote you the examples here. For example, the solar now is very much become a kind of an affordable piece for the people in general. 2,900 megawatts are already there in the system, and off grid, perhaps you would have a better number. I believe it's somewhere at 5,000 to 6,000 megawatts. So it's a substantial number that it's by very nature, by market driven facts, it's already bearing fruits and moving in that direction. But then there are certain regulatory pieces which you need to introduce, where you need to keep in mind that you have to give some kind of subsidy, tax rebates, so that people will move in that direction. For example, electronic vehicles. For example, waste management. And all those aspects, for example, infrastructure upgradation. As you mentioned, oil and gas. The challenge is that there is substantial infrastructure cost which is required. One on the monitoring of those leakages in the pipeline, and the second one is to upgrade the pipeline itself. And we, by the way, our existing pipeline system also needs to be expanded. So there are multiple funding requirements that we need to tackle. And the classic example and the classic way to approach this is by introducing the concept of taxonomy, whereby you put in all the projects in one in one place, and then develop them into a bankable proposition so that you can tap into the international funding which is available out there to address this issue. You see, Pakistan has been on the receiving end of the climate change. And 173, weather incidences happened between 1998 and 2024. While our own contribution is neither here nor there, but it's the global pressure. And climate doesn't differentiate between boundaries. So therefore, one needs to understand that it's a collective effort. We need to take it in a collective way and address it in a collective fashion as well. And for a country like Pakistan, which seriously lack resources, they need that resource support too.
Yeah, this makes sense. I always give this example that in Pakistan, roughly $5 billion of oil is essentially imported for motorcycles, for two-wheelers. There are about 30 million two-wheelers in Pakistan for maybe about 90 million of working force. Essentially, one third of the labor force essentially uses a motorbike to move to and fro. That is, I believe, the lowest hanging fruit. There are two things that we can do here. One, slowly and steadily start electrifying the motorbikes. Two, roll out public transportation across the board, whether tier 1 cities, tier 2 cities, and that will essentially solve your transportation problem. So in Pakistan, transportation is not really due to cars, it's more due to motorbikes and I would say logistics than anything else.
Absolutely. It's the public transport and it's the motorbike. So just to give you a statistic, 10% of increase in motorbikes would lead to $2 billion of saving in the petrol. And that directly, by the way, if the status quo continues, Ammar, then by 2050, our economy can get a beating of 2 to 3% of the GDP growth. Now that's a big number. It's a World Bank's calculation, which means that we are struggling to be barely over 4%, and then this climate piece is dragging us back. So we need to now taking all those actions in the right direction to make sure that this economic stability, the economic growth remains on stronger footing. The challenge is that we at times, and most of the time it's the financial piece which drives this. Short-term objectives overtake the long-term gains, and in case of climate, this is very much a reality. We need to look at climate as a long-term play for our future sustainability, our business sustainability, our own livelihood. So on one hand, when we talk about economic growth versus the climate compliance, we tend to move towards short-term objectives. The important balance is very necessary between these two aspects, and I think it's a mind shift change. It's a mindset. It's the realization, and I must compliment Dawn for taking the lead of creating that awareness which is necessary for people to understand. Look, and I say this often. So when you talk about economic growth, the ultimate objective is the poverty alleviation. Poverty alleviation leads to better life expectancy and better livelihood. Climate directly impacts your livelihood and your life expectancy. So while it may may start bearing fruit in a medium term, but this is something you can't lose your eye on the ball, because that's an indirect way of addressing the issue, while climate is a direct way of addressing the problem at hand.
So one of my considerations always has been that Pakistan is, let's say, the very early stages of growth right now. We need a lot of industrial growth, and for industrial growth you need very low cost energy, and that low cost energy essentially is very carbon intensive. So how do we go about it? Our people need to grow, our incomes need to grow. With certain carbon moratorium or let's say restrictions in play, how do we continue growing?
Yeah, Amar, this is a very typical management problem, balancing the short-term gains versus the long-term objectives. And while I understand that the compulsion for meeting the short-term economic growth targets, but can't lose the eye on the ball on the long-term aspects. And the important thing here is that it has to be a very good balance. In our case, actually, interestingly enough, the balance would be driven basically from the financial resources which are available to us. We don't have that luxury of of compromising on all short term potential gains on economic growth, merely because the economic growth per se is compromised, but also because that is also necessary to meet the short term objectives. But the balancing act is very important. And as I said earlier, it's really a matter of cost versus impact. So we need to pick those items up, which are large impact items, and see how that large impact items could have an immediate commitment of the funding, so that that piece is taken care of, while the cost piece could still wait. When you talk about climate per se, there is nothing short term. It's actually it will start bearing fruit in decades. China is an exception, by the way, in Beijing, where they tackled their climate issues in 4 years ahead of the Beijing Olympics. But otherwise, the world it's taken some time, and they are still struggling with it. So we don't need to be too concerned about it, but we should not lose the eye on the ball that this is something that we need to tackle and pick those areas first where there is less cost commitment, but more benefit could be there in terms of impact. So, for example, transport is one area. For example, the area of alternate energy. Now, the economics of solarization has become so attractive that, as we earlier talked about, the automatic control is taking place. That could merely be done through the regulatory measure. So, regulatory piece needs to be done very smartly. Resource commitment should be done very carefully, and most importantly, we just cannot achieve this kind of gigantic. We can't box the gigantic this elephant in the room until and unless there is private-public partnership. To me, it's all about people. I always quote the example of this Sable and Victor's books, fixing the climate, is one of my favorite books. And they've actually agitated how fixing the climate, the role of state becomes very important. And even in a country like US, where the role of state is kind of marginalized, but when it came to climate support, they were very much forthcoming and committed their funding towards private-public partnership. Private-public partnership is something which is not in the ethos of United States of America, but they still pursued it because this was the only way of tackling this gigantic animal.
So you specifically mentioned regulatory and capital. What specifically needs to be done to bring about regulatory change that can maybe affect behaviors and lead to better outcomes for everyone?
The way we need to figure out how we can make, as you earlier mentioned, the transportation piece, the public transportation piece, more viable and workable. The waste management piece is something that is also a thing to my mind, and that could be tackled too. The conversion of two-wheelers and three-wheelers into into electric is something which is also important, both from regulatory and commitment of capital standpoint. And the framework of private-public partnership, especially for climate, is something that must be driven by the regulations. You commit the capital also, but the commitment of the capital is much less than the regulatory piece which had to be. And if we can introduce that, I think we will have a good chance of addressing the acute problem of climate that we're confronting.
So I think what we're distilling down to is two things: conversion of let's say conventional motorbikes, which are about 30 million of those, to electric, and waste management. Let's just dig deeper into that.
And also, I would say the alternate energy piece, the solar piece, but also through the regulation, by the way. We need to make sure while a part of the existing regulation perhaps is not suited to the government. I concede that, but it has to be a very good balance to let this trend continue. And I think it's a very good trend which is going on right now.
What specifically, let's say, what three interventions do you think need to be done to really convert, let's say, petrol fuel motorbikes to electric motorbikes?
Yeah. So there, I'm already working with the government to introduce the financing package. Um, uh, there are two pieces to it. One is the local assembly. The battery we will not be anytime soon be able to to develop locally, but the assembly piece of the bike per se, so that the cost will come down, and the financing piece. If we can fit in some kind of financial support, for example, in Punjab, the student bike scheme is offering the bikes free of interest to the students. And the federal government is also, by the way, is contemplating to introduce 40,000 of these bikes to be two-wheelers and three-wheelers to be offered to the public in general at interest-free rate or a very nominal interest rate. Um, Now, these are the habits which are necessary these are the interventions which are necessary to change the habits and move people towards. So, solarization we talked about. For waste management also, for example, look, there is an there is waste has a lot of peripheries to offer. So if we do the waste management right, we will not only contribute less towards the economic, towards the climate agenda, towards the climate pollution, but it will helpful also from developing industries like recycling of various waste, which, by the way, it itself would save a substantial amount of money for the economy. I think it's World Bank which has calculated $1 trillion could be saved in the region, South Asia region, if the recycling business becomes, a name of the game and introduce that efficiency. And then, waste to energy per se, also something which is clean energy on one side, on the other side, it's actually a double benefit sort of to the climate. For both the aspects.
Yeah, fully agreed here. So in the case of waste management, most waste management in the country, I would say 95%, is largely state supported, whether that's province or whether it's a district, so on and so forth. That is something that is fully in control of the state through its various branches. So I would believe that some kind of a public-private partnership will really help in making this process more efficient. I just worked on it a while back, where essentially whatever waste you collect, that can be used, essentially that can be split into metals, paper, agri and everything else. Metals can be recycled, paper can be recycled as well, and agri, whatever food is, that becomes fertilizer, and whatever is remaining, that's maybe 20-25% of waste, that's literally burned to create energy. That is where the sovereign, whether that's at the federal level, provincial, or even at district level, needs to really come into action. How do we do that?
It's spot on that the real problem is on the regulatory piece there. Because it's quite complex. The ownership of the waste actually varies within seconds from the owner of that waste per se to the moment it touches the ground, it's owned by somebody else. To me, the starting point for that is the devolution itself. Now, it's a much broader an issue to address, and it may address many of our problems. But when you talk about waste management itself, I think it's the starting point is the devolution of powers there, and resource, and financial as well as administrative powers, and it must be driven by the local governments. Until unless you empower the local governments to create that law, and the infrastructure, and they have the financial authority to it, I don't think that the waste management say would have that kind of impact. We can have various interventions in organization like OGDCL, for example. There we are. I could think of, OBM, which is based mud that we've introduced, where it's a waste, but we are trying to use this waste by taking the polluted ingredients out of it to reuse this as a chemical. For example, floating treatment wetlands to waste, whereby the water that comes out of the in our process, we refine this and use this for agriculture purposes. Now those interventions could still be done, and the organization like OGDCL can do it very well. But if you really want to have a real impact of the waste management to have and our major problem is in the urban areas. To address them, devolution of authority is the name of the game. Until we do that, I don't think that the waste management will bear the real benefits that we are looking
It's
for.
more of an administrative problem than a financial problem.
I think the financial piece will come through if we'll be able to address the administrative
For
issue.
example, Karachi, every electricity consumer in Karachi is paying 400 rupees for as a more of a municipal tax. So the financial is being sorted, but the administrative bit is still convoluted. Where is the waste really going? You still see waste there, and I believe there is a lot of value in that waste as well.
Yes.
So I fully agree with you. Again, we come back to your point that it's more of an efficiency problem than a capital problem right now. So coming to a more specific area here, that is something which is not, let's say, held back by political or administrative issues. That is emission of methane through or up through gas pipelines, so the gas distribution network. That is something that can be fixed by 2 or 3 entities from a more of an umbrella approach. How does that work out?
So, Mar, you are well aware of the financial health of our gas distribution companies. So, expecting them to do anything would be a bit of a stretch. So, what is need to be done? And I've been talking about it. In fact, I happened to just have a discussion with the World Bank delegation, which was recently visiting here. And one of the ways of dealing with this problem, so there are two pieces to it. One is the piece related to the detection of those leakages through infrared, equipment to be placed so that you detect it quickly and then address them quickly as well. And we are talking about, a substantial amounts of money here. 1% leakage would lead to 200 to 300, billion cubic feet of gas to be saved. And gas is money. So therefore, what is required to be done? And then obviously, even if you detect it, then to address that and upgrading the system requires a lot of money. To me, the starting point would be that now we really need to think out the box and see what can be done in this space. And I think the government really seriously start thinking about offering this as a concession. So the infrastructure may still be owned by the government, but the transportation of the molecules will be given out as concessions to the private sector. And the moment you will give it to the private sector, they will have the resources to then put up the detection machines, and also the upgradation resources committed to they will have the resources to commit to upgrade that infrastructure too. So all our other problems aside, but at least this problem could be addressed through this mechanism. And this is what I have had discussion with the World Bank delegation, that we should seriously think about agitating it to the policymakers, that they must consider now giving out these, pipeline infrastructure as part of the concession on lease. Our current leakage is around 6 to 7%. The global average is around 2 to 3%. And we're talking about a substantial saving there. If we'll be able to bring it down to the global averages, it would have a direct impact on our GDP. And I would tend to say it maybe a couple of points.
So I think we come back to earlier points. More of an efficiency thing. Just having more efficient infrastructure in place will not just only save money for you, increase productivity, but also reduce emissions in the process. And I believe something on that line is already happening with more of public-private partnership type of a structure, where essentially you can use the pipeline to supply private molecules, and then that would lead to better understanding of the situation. So I think broadly we have figured out that if there are emissions, they're largely of three types. You've got transportation, and that can be solved through a gradual conversion or transition to electric. And there are multiple aspects to it. We can do some financing, we can do some, let's say, behavioral change, and slowly and steadily we will have, more importantly, a regulatory body that ensures that engines or efficiency is, fitness of the vehicle is held paramount. And then we've got waste management. We agreed there that you need to have some kind of devolution of power from the federal to the provincial to the district level for this to be made more efficient. And then we come to distribution companies, gas distribution companies, where emergence of some kind of a private-public structure would essentially lead to better outcomes. So trying to sum all of it, I think we're not really in a bad position as other countries in the world right now, because all of our problems can essentially be solved through minor interventions or tweaks while we continue on the growth path. What three policies or what a few policies would you really suggest that should be done over the next 6 months to really push Pakistan toward the cleaner and greener agenda and essentially improve productivity in the process as well?
So look, as I said, the low-hanging fruit are very much there in the form of alternate energy. So we need the existing regulation and see how we can make them. There has to be mutually beneficial. Otherwise, they will not be sustainable. I think the existing one is perhaps not mutually beneficial. That needs to be looked at because I don't want the whole conversion piece to get disrupted on the way anywhere. We also need to and by the way, interestingly enough, in climate there are three sorts of framework that would be followed. One is to look towards the state. The second one is to look towards the market, and the third one is to the state to intervene, but to the extent of excluding some aspects from the market. And here I would suggest that we must look at the third aspect where some of the aspects which needed to be taken out of the markets, the regulation has to be made in such a way that it will promote investment into a long-term project. For example, project financing for a vehicle, whether it's four-wheeler, three-wheeler, or two-wheeler, manufacturing in Pakistan must be incentivized better. And that intervention, to my mind, is very important, not only from job creation standpoint, economic growth standpoint, but also addressing the climate issue. So transportation is one piece, alternate energy related to it is other piece. The last example that I quoted to you related to both of them actually. And then again, it's a larger question to address, but there is no way we can leave it unanswered. We have to empower the local governments to address this at the local level. Look, the climate issue are pretty much like education and health issues, where the problem is same across all the global, across the globe or all the countries, but the solutions are very localized. And a country like Pakistan, which is at 230 million people, the most heterogeneous, you need to have the local solution down to the local government level to address these climate issues like education and health, as I said, and not as a larger a policy intervention that could help in addressing it. It varies from city to city, urban areas to rural area, town to town even. The requirements differ. And we need to empower the local governments and devolution of authority to take this agenda forward.
I think it's important to understand here that extreme climate events will continue to happen with absolutely no fault of ours. And this is where the international climate community needs actually to step up and take responsibility, because whatever is happening, it's not because of our emissions, of our doing, it's because of whatever is happening elsewhere. And this is where we really need that capital support to ensure that we can do some kind of a climate transition, develop the climate resistant infrastructure to really avoid the pitfalls of whatever change is coming.
Yeah, so while I completely agree with you what you're saying, but frankly, I will take the blame for it because we are also not putting up the bankable proposition in front of them. So we need to, as a country, need to have a taxonomy whereby we'll be able to put those projects together, make them bankable, and then go and approach these international funding institutions to come through and support these. Bank of Punjab recently, by the way, has secured 54 million euro line from AFD of France, the France DFI. That only happened because they saw what we were doing, what we are capable of doing. But when we talk about tapping this funding en masse, we need to have projects which then have to be worked backwards to be bankable and then attract this funding from our.
I think this makes absolute sense. Thank you, Zafar sir, for your time.
You're most
I think
welcome.
we really touched upon the key areas that we need to focus on rather than just talking about solar and renewable and hydro. What really needs to be done on the ground to make actual change in place. Thank you, Zafar sir, for your time. It's always
Thank
been
you.
a pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for your time. Till next time.